When the mountain collapsed, they found more tiny skeletons than miners. In 1890, Colorado, an orphanage didn't just care for children, it sold them to the mines. These young souls, frail and vulnerable, were treated as nothing more than living ore, worked to death in the dark tunnels beneath the mountain. The mine owners saw them as a commodity, to be bought, used, and discarded. But when disaster struck and the mountain collapsed, the world discovered something horrifying. Beneath the rubble, more tiny skeletons were uncovered than miners' children who had been worked to death, their lives sacrificed for profit. This is the shocking story of how innocent lives were crushed beneath the greed of industry. In the spring of 1888, Emily was just another child abandoned by the world, her life a tangled mess of poverty and loneliness. At the age of 9, she had already experienced more heartache than most adults could ever comprehend. The orphanage in Colorado promised a fresh start, a place where children like her could find shelter, warmth, and maybe, just maybe, a family. But what Emily didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this shelter was merely a front-a-twisted factory designed to feed the insatiable hunger of the nearby mine. The building looked harmless enough from the outside, old but well kept, its windows large and welcoming. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood, and the soft murmur of children's laughter echoed through the halls. Emily felt a flicker of hope until she saw the lifeless faces of the children who worked there. They didn't smile, they didn't laugh, they walked with the same tired, vacant expressions as the adults in the village, their eyes filled with a bleak knowledge of the world's cruelty. But even they didn't know what lay ahead. None of them could have. On her first day, Emily was assigned a small bed in a shared room. Her only possession, a ragged doll, was tucked carefully under her arm. She was shown around by Sarah, an older girl with kind eyes but a haunted look that Emily couldn't quite place. Sarah didn't say much but smiled reassuringly, guiding Emily to the dining hall where other children were, eating quietly, their heads bent over their plates. There was no chatter, no jokes, just silence. After supper, the children were lined up in the common room for their nightly chores. As Emily was handed a broom, she looked around at the others. They moved with mechanical precision. Each child knew their task, knew what was expected of them. They didn't question, they didn't complain. Emily wasn't sure why, but something about it felt wrong. The overseer, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Graham, stood at the front of the room, her eyes sharp as she watched the children. Her gaze swept over them like a hawk eyeing prey. "No slacking," she barked. "The sooner you finish, the sooner you can sleep." Emily felt the weight of her own exhaustion settling in her bones. She had traveled a long way to get here, and the day events had left her drained. Yet there was no time to rest. The broom in her hands seemed heavier by the minute. When the chores were done, Mrs. Graham led them to a small room at the back of the orphanage. There, the children were told where they would sleep. The room was dark, with only a faint light coming from the oil lamps along the walls. Emily was directed to a corner where she lay down on the thin mattress, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something wasn't right. But sleep didn't come easily. The silence of the orphanage was suffocating, and Emily tossed and turned. It wasn't until the dead of night, when she could no longer keep her eyes closed, that she heard something, a faint sound, like the whisper of footsteps echoing down the hall. She lay still, straining her ears to catch the sound again. It was faint, but it was there, and it wasn't coming from the other children. Curiosity got the best of her. Slowly, she slipped out of bed, her feet making no sound on the cold floor. She crept toward the door, and as quietly as she could, opened it. The hallway was dark, but she could make out the shape of a figure moving toward the far end. The footsteps were muffled, but they weren't the hurried steps of a worker. It sounded deliberate, slow. Without thinking, Emily followed. She didn't know where she was going, but something in her gut told her that what was happening in the orphanage wasn't just the usual order of things. Her heart pounded in her chest as she rounded corners, staying close to the walls to avoid being seen. She finally stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall, partially cracked open. The faint sound of voices filtered through. She inched closer, her breath catching in her throat. The voices were low, but she could make out a few words. One voice, rough and commanding, belonged to a man she didn't recognize. "They'll be ready by next week," he said. "The mine's need is urgent. The smaller ones are always more valuable." Emily's blood ran cold. The other voice, a woman's, answered in hushed tones. "We've been sending them, but we need more. The buyers want fresh stock, those who haven't been broken yet." Emily could hardly breathe. The weight of the words crushed her, and she felt her stomach twist into knots. She was just another commodity, another small body to be sold to the mines. Her heart raced as the realization settled in. The orphanage wasn't a sanctuary. It was a factory, and she was just another product to be pushed out the door when they were done with her. Before she could move, the door swung open, and she was spotted. Mrs. Graham's cold, unforgiving eyes locked onto hers. "What are you doing here, child?" she demanded, her voice sharp as a knife. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mrs. Graham grabbed her by the arm and yanked her forward. "You will never speak of this," she hissed. "Understand?" Emily nodded silently, fear rising in her chest. Mrs. Graham's grip tightened for a moment, then she shoved her back toward her room. But as Emily lay in her bed trying to force the images from her mind, the words echoed in her ears. Fresh stock, small bodies. The mine had been taking children from the orphanage for years, and Emily was next. But what Emily didn't realize was that the nightmare had just begun. As she would soon learn, the mine wasn't just a place of labor. It was a graveyard for the forgotten, and she would soon be forced to confront a horrifying truth that would change her life forever. Emily woke the next morning to the sound of a bell ringing through the orphanage. It was too early for her to have had any restful sleep. Her body ached from the hard mattress and the weight of what she had overheard the night before. She had hoped it was all a bad dream, that the harsh words of the mine buyers hadn't been real, but deep down, she knew they were. The orphanage wasn't a sanctuary, it was a prison, and she was its next inmate. She had barely rubbed the sleep from her eyes when Mrs. Graham appeared at her door, a stern look on her face. "Get up," she barked, her voice as sharp as ever. "You'll start work today. No slacking." Emily had no idea what she meant by work. She hadn't been told anything, but Mrs. Graham didn't give her time to ask. She was ushered down the hallway with the other children, their faces all pale, eyes hollow. They were led outside to a long, narrow path that led to the mine, which loomed in the distance like a monstrous beast ready to swallow them whole. The walk was silent, save for the heavy, labored breathing of the children around her. Emily felt her stomach twist in knots. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the fear that hung in the air told her it wouldn't be good. When they reached the mine, she saw the workers, adults and children hauling ore out of the earth, their faces covered in grime, their bodies bent under the weight of their labor. The mine was massive, its entrance dark and foreboding. The ground was slick with mud, and the air was thick with dust, a sharp metallic scent that made Emily gag. "Start working," Mrs. Graham commanded, pushing Emily forward. Before Emily could say anything, she was handed a small pickaxe. "Dig," Mrs. Graham instructed. "If you stop, you'll regret it." Emily hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the others. Some children were younger than her, others barely able to walk, but all of them had one thing in common: they were all working. Emily clenched her jaw and picked up the pickaxe. She didn't know what else to do. Refusing to work would only make things worse. The mine was dark, cold, and suffocating. The children were led into the narrowest of tunnels, just wide enough for them to crawl through. Emily had to squeeze through the tight space, her chest pressed against the jagged walls as she crawled forward. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe, and the deeper they went, the colder it became. She could hear the sound of the pickaxes striking the rock, the rhythmic pounding that echoed through the tunnels. She had never been so scared in her life. As they dug deeper, Emily began to notice something odd. The older children, those who had been working the mines longer, seemed different. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes dull. They barely spoke, their movements sluggish. It was as if their spirits had been crushed along with their bodies. One of the older boys, Nathan, who had been working beside Emily, caught her eye. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, but his eyes were sharp, full of a quiet understanding. He leaned in close to Emily as they dug. "Don't ask questions," he whispered, his voice low. "Just work. Don't look too closely. If you do, they'll make you disappear." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't understand what he meant. "Disappear?" she whispered back, barely audible. Nathan didn't answer. Instead, he continued digging, his movements robotic, as if he was too exhausted to care. Emily didn't push him for more information. She could already see the way the other children avoided eye contact, the way they kept their heads down, as if they were terrified of drawing attention to themselves. The hours passed, but it felt like days. Emily's hands were raw from gripping the pickaxe, her back aching with every movement. The only thing that kept her going was the fact that she couldn't afford to stop, not without facing the consequences. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, there was a sudden noisy crack, followed by a low rumble. The ground shook, and Emily's heart leaped in her chest. The mine, she realized, was unstable. The cave-ins were a constant threat. Before she could react, she felt the earth tremble beneath her. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in on her. Rocks began to fall, and the sound of collapsing earth echoed through the tunnels. "Get out! Get out!" Nathan shouted, his voice frantic. "Now!" The children scrambled to the exit, but the tunnel was narrowing. Emily's chest tightened with fear. They couldn't escape, there was no way out. The air was thick with dust, and the rumbling grew louder. The mine was collapsing. The chaos that followed was indescribable. Emily's legs were unsteady, and she stumbled, barely managing to keep her footing as the tunnel shook violently. Children screamed as the ground beneath them cracked and split. Rocks fell from above, and dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Just as Emily thought she was going to be crushed, a figure appeared from the smoke and dust stone of the overseers. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit. "Move!" he shouted, his grip vice-like as he dragged her through the debris. By the time they reached the surface, Emily was gasping for air. Her heart was pounding it, and she could barely comprehend what had just happened. They were outside, but the mine was a disaster zone. The entrance was completely blocked off by fallen rocks, and the cries of the children still trapped inside echoed through the air. Emily didn't know how long they stood there, waiting for the rescue teams to arrive, but it felt like an eternity. She couldn't shake the images of the mine collapsing, of the children trapped inside. Something had to change, but Emily didn't know how. But the collapse wasn't just an accident. It was a signal warning that the mine's greed was going to consume more than just the children, and Emily's fight for survival was just beginning. What she didn't realize was that the worst was yet to come. The collapse of the mine had left the children shaken, but there was no time for recovery. The overseers, unmoved by the tragedy, wasted no time in rounding up the survivors and ushering them back to work. Emily's body ached, her hands covered in blisters, and her mind was clouded with fear. But there was one thought that kept repeating itself in her head. This mine, this orphanage, it wasn't just exploiting children. It was using them, sacrificing them for something far worse than labor. For the first time since she had arrived at the orphanage, Emily realized just how deeply embedded the cycle of exploitation was. The collapse wasn't just an accident. It was a consequence of a system that had been running for decades, a system built on the backs of children who were treated like commodities to be used until they were of no further use. The days following the disaster were filled with unease. The children who had survived the collapse were quickly put back to work. Those who were too weak, injured to continue, were quietly taken away. Emily watched as more children disappeared, as if they had never existed. There were no funerals, no mourning. It was as if their lives had never mattered. One evening, after a long day of work, Emily overheard a conversation between two of the overseers, their voices hushed but urgent. She had learned to keep her distance, to avoid attracting attention, but this time, curiosity got the best of her. "They're getting desperate," one of the overseers said. "They need more bodies for the mine, and the orphanage is running out of children. If we don't find a way to keep them coming, we'll lose the operation." The other overseer, a man named Mr. Daniels, nodded grimly. "I know, but the children are starting to break. We need fresh stock, new blood. The buyers are getting impatient. They want children who haven't been worked to death." Emily froze. The buyers. She had heard whispers of them before, the men who paid for children to work in the mines, but this was the first time she had heard them referred to as buyers. She didn't understand what they meant, but the cold dread that gripped her heart told her she didn't want to know. She tried to slip away quietly, but as she turned to leave, she accidentally knocked over a bucket. The overseers' heads whipped around, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Who's there?" Mr. Daniels growled, his voice low but threatening. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She knew she had been caught. She stepped out of the shadows, trying to act as though she belonged. I was just cleaning," she stammered, her voice trembling. The overseers exchanged a glance, and for a moment, Emily thought she was done for. But then, to her surprise, Mr. Daniels simply nodded and turned back to his conversation. "Keep working," he said dismissively. Emily didn't wait to be told twice. She quickly retreated, her thoughts racing. New blood, fresh stock. It wasn't just about labor, it was about something more sinister. The children were being bred for this, raised for one purpose, to work in the mines until their bodies were broken and their lives spent. And once they could no longer work, they were discarded like refuse. Her stomach turned at the thought. The more she learned, the more twisted the truth became. The orphanage wasn't just a place of refuge. It was a breeding ground, a factory designed to provide the mine with a steady supply of children, each one worth more as they grew, but nothing once their value had been extracted. But Emily wasn't the only one starting to understand the horrors around her. Nathan, the older boy she had met on her first day in the mines, had been watching her carefully for days. He knew she was starting to figure things out, and the last thing he wanted was for her to make the same mistakes he had. One night, as Emily sat in the corner of the room, lost in her thoughts, Nathan approached her quietly. His eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, her throat dry. "They don't care about us," Nathan continued. "We're just resources to them. Living ore. That's all we've ever been." Emily's heart sank. The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Living ore. She wanted to deny it, to believe that Nathan was exaggerating, but deep down she knew it was the truth. "We're not even human to them," Nathan added, his voice bitter. "We're just tools to dig up the earth, and when they're done with us, they'll throw us away like nothing." Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She'd been thinking it, but hearing it out loud made it feel too real, too undeniable. The mine wasn't just a place of work, it was a death sentence, and it was claiming her life too. "But we can't just let this keep happening," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "We have to do something." Nathan shook his head. "You don't understand. We can't fight them. They have too much power. If you try to escape or resist, they'll punish you, worse than you can imagine." Emily's mind raced. She had already seen the consequences of trying to defy the system. The children who had tried to run or speak out were either silenced or made to disappear. But Emily couldn't accept this. She couldn't accept being nothing more than a cog in the machine, her life wasted in a mine for the profit of men who didn't even care enough to remember her name. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Mrs. Graham appeared at the door, her cold eyes scanning the room. "Get some sleep," she ordered curtly. "Tomorrow you'll be back to work, and I expect no more of this talking back." As she left, Emily felt a rising sense of urgency. She couldn't wait. She couldn't just accept what had been thrust upon her. There had to be a way out there, had to be a way to stop this madness. But Emily didn't know that the worst was yet to come. As she made plans to break free from the mine, she was about to learn a terrifying truth. The mine's grip wasn't just physical, it was deeply, disturbingly psychological. And the moment she tried to fight back, she'd be stepping into a nightmare far darker than she could have ever imagined. The mine had become Emily's prison. Day after day, she was forced deeper into its heart, her body aching, her mind clouded with exhaustion. She worked alongside the other children, their faces a mirror of her own tired, hollow and broken. The darkness of the tunnel seemed to seep into her very soul, and the only thing that kept her moving was the faint, desperate hope that one day she would find a way out. But as the days wore on, Emily began to see the truth more clearly. The mine wasn't just a place of labor, it was a twisted system built on the exploitation of children. She had suspected as much before, but now she knew for certain. The children weren't just working to mine the earth, they were being bred for it. They were bred to work until they were no longer useful, and then discarded like tools when they were of no more value. It was Nathan, the older boy who had tried to warn her, who finally confirmed what Emily had suspected. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit common room, their tired eyes meeting across the room, Nathan leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been seeing it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. Emily nodded, her heart sinking. "They're not just using us for our labor," Nathan continued. "We're part of a system that has been in place for years. The Orphanage, just a front for the mine. The children are bred here. They're raised to be workers, to be living ore." The words hit Emily like a blow. She had suspected something dark was at play, but this was worse than anything she had imagined. They weren't just being used, they were being manufactured. "It's worse than that," Nathan said, his voice shaking. "They don't just breed us for labor. They break us too. They know exactly how much we can take. And when we're no longer useful, they get rid of us." The realization settled like a weight on Emily's chest. The children were nothing more than disposable commodity stools to be used until they were no longer needed. When they were too weak to work, too broken to contribute, they were cast aside, forgotten. Emily's mind raced. She had to get out. She had to escape before they took everything from her. But how? The guards were always watching, and the tunnels were endless. The mine was a labyrinth, and escape seemed impossible. Worse, Emily realized that even if she did manage to escape, what awaited her outside would be no better. The world had turned its back on her long ago, and the town that surrounded the mine was complicit in its operation. The very people who lived there were benefiting from the child labor, either directly or indirectly. It was then that Emily understood the full extent of her captivity. The mine was more than just a place where children worked at. It was a grotesque system of control designed to break the spirits of the children and turn them into nothing more than machines. And the orphanage? It was nothing more than a factory, feeding the mine with fresh bodies, training the next generation of workers, before they even knew what was happening to them. As Emily sat there, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth, a thought gnawed at the edges of her mind. What if I am next? It wasn't long before she got her answer. The very next day, the overseers came for her. It was early morning when Mrs. Graham appeared at Emily's door, her face cold and expressionless. She didn't say a word as she grabbed Emily by the arm and yanked her from the bed. Emily tried to protest, but Mrs. Graham only tightened her grip. "Time to start your real work," she said with a sneer. Emily's stomach twisted. She had no idea what was about to happen, but she knew it wasn't good. The way Mrs. Graham had said its real work was a chilling promise of something worse than what she had already endured. As she was dragged through the hallways, Emily caught sight of Nathan. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear, and then, to her horror, he shook his head slightly, as if to say, "Don't resist. It's too late." The overseers led her to a different part of the mine, one that she had never seen before. The air was colder here, the tunnels even darker. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols she couldn't decipher. It was as if the mine itself had been built on ancient, forgotten knowledge that didn't care for human life. They led her to a small, isolated room. Inside, there were cages, dozens of them, each containing a child. The children were all small, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes wide with fear. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she looked around. These were the children who had been bred for the mine, the ones who were too young to work yet, but who had been raised for this very purpose. The overseers opened a cage, and Emily was shoved inside. The cold metal of the bars sent a chill through her. She backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room was small, the air thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The children in the cages looked at her with hollow eyes, as if they had already accepted their fate. Some of them were too young to understand, but others knew exactly what was happening. They had been born into this life raised to be workers, to be sacrifices for the mine. And then, Emily heard it. A door creaked open somewhere in the distance, and a man's voice echoed through the dark, low and guttural. "Time to bring in the fresh stock. Let's see if they're ready for the mines." Emily's heart stopped. She looked at the other children in the cages. They had all been born for one purpose, to be worked to death. But Emily wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become part of the system. And as she faced the terrifying truth of her existence, she realized there was no turning back. Either she would break under the weight of the mine's cruelty, or she would rise up and fight back against the dark force that had stolen her childhood. The days following Emily's confinement in the small cage felt like an eternity. Each morning, the overseers would unlock the cage, pull her out, and force her to work in the mines. The work was brutal digging, hauling, crawling through narrow tunnels where the air was thick with dust. It was as if the mine had taken everything from her body, her spirit, and now her hope. The other children in the cages barely even looked up anymore. They had already accepted their fate, their eyes dull with the same resignation that had taken root in Emily's heart. But one thing had changed. Emily's resolve had hardened. She had spent days thinking about escape, planning, waiting for the right moment. She had overheard enough conversations, seen enough to understand the full extent of the horrors happening within the mine. The overseers were more than just cruel taskmasters. They were guardians of a system designed to break the children, to turn them into lifeless machines that would work until their bodies were spent, then be discarded without a second thought. But Emily couldn't accept that. She wouldn't let it be her fate. One night, as she lay on the cold floor of her cage, her mind spinning with plans, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A conversation from outside the room just loud enough for her to hear. "They're breaking," one of the overseers said, his voice low and urgent. "The children, they're starting to crack. We need to bring in more fresh ones. Fresh ones." Emily's stomach churned. She understood now. The orphanage was a breeding ground for workers, a factory designed to keep the mine supplied with bodies. And when those bodies could no longer work, they were disposed of like yesterday's trash. The buyers didn't just want children for labor, they wanted them young, unbroken. They were part of a grotesque cycle, and once they were broken, they were of no more value. But as Emily lay in the darkness, listening to the whispers, she realized something else, something worse. The mine wasn't just destroying them physically, it was breaking them mentally. The children had been conditioned, manipulated into thinking they were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. And that was when Emily made her choice. She couldn't let herself become like them. She couldn't become another lifeless shell of a child, another forgotten worker in the system. She had to fight back. She had to break free. The very next morning, Emily began to act on her plan. The overseers unlocked the cages, and the children shuffled out like zombies, their faces hollow, their movements slow and tired. Emily's mind raced, her pulse quickening as she scanned the room, looking for her chance. And then she saw a door, slightly ajar. The overseers were distracted, arguing among themselves in the corner of the room. It was her chance. She had to move quickly. Emily didn't hesitate. She darted toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the overseers' voices growing louder, but she didn't look back. She pushed open the door and slipped into the hallway, her breath shallow as she crept down the dark corridor. The sounds of the mine filled her ears, the distant thrum of pickaxes striking rock, the faint cries of the other children echoing through the tunnels. Emily didn't stop. She ran, her legs burning with the effort, her mind focused only on escape. But as she rounded a corner, she ran straight into something, or rather, someone. It was Mr. Daniels, one of the overseers, his cold, calculating eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The two of them stood there, frozen in time, staring at each other. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't back down. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Without a word, Mr. Daniels grabbed her by the arm, his grip unrelenting. Emily struggled, but he was too strong. He yanked her down the hallway, his face twisted in fury. "You think you can escape?" he sneered. "You think you can run from this?" Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let him drag her back to the cage. She had come too far. But as Mr. Daniels pulled her, something inside her snapped. With all her strength, Emily slammed her foot into his knee, forcing him to stumble back. In the moment of confusion, she twisted free from his grip and ran. She ran as fast as she could, not caring where she was going, just as long as it was away from him, away from the mine. She didn't stop running until her lungs burned, until her legs could barely carry her. The darkness of the tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, but Emily didn't care. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. And then, just as she was about to give in to the exhaustion, she saw Ida light, the faint glow of the exit. She was so close. Her heart surged with hope. She was almost free. But just as she reached the door, a hand shot out of the shadows, grabbing her wrist and yanking her back. "Not so fast," a voice growled. It was Nathan. For a moment, Emily thought she was dreaming. "Nathan?" she gasped, her voice hoarse from the run. "What are you doing?" Nathan's face was grim, his eyes filled with something between pity and fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "You can't escape. It's too late. They'll catch you. They always catch you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had come so far, and now Nathan was telling her to stop, telling her to give up. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "I won't stop. I can't." But Nathan shook his head, his grip tightening on her arm. "You don't understand. The system may control everything. The mine, the orphanage. It's all part of a cycle that will never end. And then, the most horrifying words of all, you can't escape the mine, Emily. It's already inside you." Emily didn't know it yet, but her fight for survival was just beginning. As she stood in the darkness with Nathan, facing the terrifying truth, she realized that escaping the mine was only half the battle. The real nightmare was still to come, and it was one that could follow her wherever she went. Emily didn't know how much longer she could keep running. The walls of the mine seemed to close in on her with every passing second, the sound of her breath echoing in the tunnels. Nathan's words haunted her. "You can't escape." But she wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. Her feet stumbled across the uneven ground, and the dim light ahead flickered like a distant hope. She was so close to the exit, the path out of this hell. She could almost taste the fresh air, but just as her hands reached for the wooden door at the end of the tunnel, the ground beneath her feet gave way. A low, violent rumble shook the earth, and Emily's heart stopped in her chest. It wasn't just the earth shifting. The mine itself was starting to collapse. Rocks began to fall, heavy and loud, their crash echoing in the stillness. The air filled with the deafening sound of creaking wood and shifting earth. She could barely stand as the ground shook beneath her, her legs threatening to give way. A scream ripped from her throat as the tunnel walls buckled around her, narrowing and collapsing. She turned, desperate to escape, but the path she had just come from was gone. The exit was sealed behind a mountain of rubble. She was trapped. In a panic, Emily ran down another narrow passage, her body on fire from exhaustion, but the tremors only grew stronger. The mine was coming apart, piece by piece. She could hear the distant cries of the other children, their voices blending with the rumbling chaos around her. The overseer's commands were drowned out by the overwhelming noise, and Emily realized something far worse. The cave-in wasn't an accident. This was no natural disaster. The mine had been built on instability. It had always been a ticking time bomb, but now it was detonating with horrifying precision. The greedy hands that had built this hell, that had exploited the children, were now reaping what they had sown. In the chaos, Emily spotted a figure emerging from the smoke and dust. It was Nathan, his face pale and covered in grime, his eyes wide with terror. "Emily!" he shouted over the noise, grabbing her arm as the ground beneath them trembled again. "We need to get out. Now!" But Emily didn't move. Her heart pounded as she realized something else's something even. Worse than the collapse itself. "They're still in here," she said, her voice shaking. "The others, the children, they'll never get out in time." Nathan's face tightened. They know. They've known for years. He didn't need to say more. The truth hung heavy in the air. The collapse wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a byproduct of greed. It was a consequence of everything that had been allowed to happen beneath this mountain, of the children used and discarded like tools. And now the mine was taking back what it had stolen. Emily's blood ran cold as the walls shook again. She had to leave. She had to survive. But as she looked back at the debris falling behind her, she knew there was no turning back. The mine was her prison end now. It had become her tomb. Hook. But as Emily and Nathan struggled to survive, they would soon discover that the collapse wasn't just a disaster. It was a reckoning, and the mine's hunger was far from satisfied. The mine was chaos. What had once been a place of constant movement and labor was now a tomb, its walls crumbling, the air thick with dust and desperation. Emily and Nathan stumbled through the wreckage, their legs weak from exhaustion, their lungs burning from the thick smoke that filled the corridors. The ground shook beneath them, a reminder that the mine was collapsing around them. "We have to find the others," Emily gasped, her eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of life. Nathan grabbed her arm, pulling her to a stop. "It's too late," he said, his voice tight. With fear, "We're the lucky ones. We made it out." But Emily refused to believe him. Her mind raced with thoughts of the other children still trapped inside, those who had been too weak to escape, those who hadn't been fast enough. "We can't leave them behind," she said, shaking her head. "There has to be a way to help them." Nathan's expression darkened, and he seemed to hesitate for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the collapsing mine. Then, without another word, he led Emily deeper into the wreckage. They moved cautiously, careful to avoid the falling rocks and debris. The sound of the collapse was deafening, but as they pushed forward, they began to hear something else, a faint, distant sound. It was a cry, soft and desperate. Emily's heart jumped in her chest. It was one of the children. She rushed toward the sound, Nathan at her heels, until they reached a small, partially blocked-off tunnel. Emily pulled at the rocks, her fingers scraping against the rough surface as she desperately tried to clear the way. "Help!" came the cry again, clearer this time. It was a girl's voice, muffled by the debris but unmistakable. Emily's pulse quickened. She had to get to her. They both worked frantically, their hearts pounding as they cleared the rubble, piece by piece. When they finally reached the tunnel's opening, Emily found herself staring at the face of a chilled small girl, no older than 7, trapped beneath the wreckage. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, but when she saw Emily, she reached out a trembling hand. "Please, help me," she whispered. Emily's stomach churned as she pulled the girl from the rubble. She was covered in dust and blood, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. As Emily helped her to her feet, Nathan stood still, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing we can do," he said quietly. "The rest of them are gone." Emily turned to him, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Nathan's eyes met hers, and for the first time Emily saw something more than fear in them. There was resignation and something darker. The children who were taken for the work were never meant to leave. They were never meant to survive. Emily's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" Nathan took a step closer, lowering his voice so the girl wouldn't hear. "The mine didn't just exploit them for labor. It harvested them, Emily. They were bred to work, and when they were no longer useful, they were sacrificed." Emily's stomach turned, a feeling of icy dread creeping up her spine. "Sacrifice?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Nathan nodded, his face grim. "The buyers didn't just want workers. They wanted bodies, children who were disposable. When the mine was built, it was designed to be a trap, a place where children would be worked to death and buried beneath the earth. The collapse? It wasn't an accident. It was planned." A chill ran through Emily. The realization hit her with full force of mind. The orphanage, the system that had controlled their lives for so long, yet had all been designed to exploit and discard them. And the collapse, the disaster they had just survived, wasn't a mistake. It was part of the cycle. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Nathan looked away, a flash of guilt crossing his face. "I didn't want you to know. It's too late for me. But it's not too late for you. Get out while you still can." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I can't just leave," she said, shaking her head. "There are still children trapped in here. They need help. We need to get them out." Nathan stepped back, his face hardening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The system is already broken. You can't fix it. It's too far gone." Emily stood her ground, her mind racing. The truth was clear now. This wasn't just about escape. It was about survival, and it was about justice for the children who had died in this hell. She couldn't leave them behind, not when she had the chance to make it right. "I'm not leaving," Emily said, her voice steady with resolve. "Not now, not ever." She turned to the girl, who was still trembling in her arms. "We're going to get out of here, together." But what Emily didn't know was that the collapse had uncovered something far more dangerous than just the mine's twisted legacy. The truth about the children's exploitation had begun to surface, and soon, those in charge would do anything to stop from being exposed. The real battle had only just begun. The dust still hung thick in the air as Emily, Nathan, and the girl whose name was Sarah pushed forward through the labyrinth of tunnels. Each step felt like it could be their last, but Emily couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. The mine was collapsing, but there was still something she needed to uncover. The truth. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the chaos above were replaced by eerie silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the mine's crumbling walls. Emily's heart raced. She wasn't sure where they were headed, but she had a strange feeling that there was something important that she hadn't seen yet. Nathan was leading them, his pace slow but steady, his face drawn and tired. He had been through this before, so many times, and Emily could see that part of him had already given up. He didn't believe there was any point in fighting anymore. But Emily wasn't ready to give up. As they neared a junction in the tunnel, Emily spotted something strange, an old, rusted door hidden behind a pile of rubble. It was unlike anything she had seen before in the mine. The door was solid steel, and unlike the rest of the tunnels, this one seemed untouched by the decay around it. This wasn't here before," Emily murmured, glancing at Nathan. Nathan's face darkened. "Don't open it." Emily ignored him, her curiosity overpowering her fear. She stepped forward, pushing aside the rubble with trembling hands. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a small room beyond. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the faint glow of a dying lamp on the wall. But what struck Emily the most was the sight in the center of the room, rows upon rows of old dusty ledgers and papers, stacked high on metal shelves. And sitting at the very back of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was a small desk. Without saying a word, Emily stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the papers. She knew she was about to uncover something crucial, something that could finally reveal the full extent of the mine's dark history. Nathan followed, his face a mask of resignation. "You don't want to know what's in there," he said quietly, but Emily couldn't stop herself. She approached the desk and found a thick ledger lying open. She turned the pages slowly, her fingers trembling as she read the names of so many named-soft children who had been sent to the mine over the years. There were dates, amounts of money paid for each child, and the unsettling note next to each one, "Disposal complete." Her stomach turned. Disposal complete. What did that even mean? She flicked through more pages, her eyes growing wider with each entry. The names started to blur together, the sheer volume of the children's lives reduced to nothing more than numbers on a page. But then, she reached a new section, one that made her heart stop. The last page was different. It was a report from the mine's owner, dated just months ago. Emily read it aloud, her voice shaking. "The new stock will be arriving soon. The orphanage is to continue providing children in line with the established quotas. The recent collapse has been accounted for. No loss of workers." Emily's blood ran cold. The report was recent, but it wasn't the timing that disturbed her. It was the words, "the new stock, no loss of workers." She had assumed that the mine had only been using the children for labor, but now it seemed far worse than that. The children were being bred for a purpose, sold off in quantities, with no thought to their lives beyond their usefulness. "What are you seeing?" Nathan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. The realization was too much to process. She had thought the system was simply exploit the children, use them up and discard them. But this was something darker, more calculated. This wasn't just labor, it was an organized trade, a system that had been running for years. There were more names in the ledger, names Emily recognized. children who had disappeared without a trace, whose bodies had never been found. Her mind raced as she pieced together the horrifying truth. The collapse hadn't just been a disaster. It had been a way to cover up the ongoing trafficking of children. The mine had become a massive operation, hidden in plain sight. The orphanage was only the beginning. The system of exploitation was far wider, far deeper than she could have ever imagined. Emily, Nathan said, his voice shaky. "We can't. Stop this. You can't. It's too big. It's bigger than us." But Emily shook her head, the anger burning inside her. "No, we can stop it. This is proof. We have to get this to someone. We have to expose them." Nathan's face grew pale. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The people who control the mine control the town. They'll never let you tell anyone. You're just one child. They'll bury you like they buried all the others." Emily's heart sank. The fear in his voice was real, but she couldn't give up now. She couldn't let it all be for nothing. She turned toward the door, determined. "I have to try." Nathan reached out, grabbing her wrist. "Then you'll die here just like the rest of us." But Emily didn't pull away. She stared at him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. Hope. For the first time, Nathan wasn't just trying to survive. He was ready to fight, and he wasn't the only one. "I'm not dying here," Emily said, her voice steady. "Not if I can help it." But what Emily didn't know was that her discovery wasn't just a threat to them, innate was a declaration of war. The moment she stepped out of that room, she would become the most dangerous person in the eyes of those who ran the mine, and they wouldn't let her walk away unscathed. The door to the room where Emily had found the ledgers creaked shut behind her, the sound sharp in the eerie silence of the collapsing mine. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back into the darkness of the tunnels. She had learned the horrifying truth. The mine was far more than a place of labor. It was a grotesque system, a machine that ran on human suffering, where children were bred and traded as nothing more than commodities. But there was no time to mourn the lives lost, no time to process the horrific realization. Emily had to act. Every moment she spent in the mine now was a moment that brought her closer to death, either at the hands of the mine itself or those who ran it. The truth was out there, but no one would believe it unless she made them listen. She turned to Nathan, whose face was pale in the dim light. His eyes held a mixture of fear and uncertainty, but Emily saw something else there, now something new. The flicker of rebellion. He wasn't the same boy who had told her to give up, to accept the fate of the mine. He had seen the truth, and it terrified him, but it also ignited a spark. "We can't let this continue," Emily said, her voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. "We have to get to the town. We have to tell someone. The ledgers, the buyers, it's all proof." Nathan shook his head, his voice hoarse. "You don't get it, Emily. They'll never let us leave. They'll never let you walk out of here with that knowledge. We don't have a choice," she shot back. "We have to fight. This ends now." She turned to Sarah, the little girl who had clung to her side ever since the collapse, her wide eyes filled with fear and hope in equal measure. "Are you ready?" Emily asked, her voice soft but firm. Sarah nodded, gripping Emily's hand tightly. "I want to help. I don't want them to hurt anyone else." Emily smiled, a small but determined expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They weren't alone in this fight. The tunnels seemed endless, twisting and turning as they made their way deeper into the mine, but Emily's determination kept her moving forward. They would expose the truth, no matter what it took. But as they neared the exit, the unexpected happened. A heavy thud echoed through the tunnel, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. Before Emily could react, a figure stepped out from the shadow zone she hadn't expected to see. It was Mrs. Graham, her eyes locked onto Emily, a cold smile twisting her lips. "Did you really think you could escape, child?" she sneered. "You've seen too much. You should have stayed in your cage where you belonged." Emily froze, her mind racing. This wasn't just an overseer, it was someone higher up, someone who knew the true nature of the mine. Mrs. Graham had been a part of it all. She had known everything. Behind Mrs. Graham, several of the mine's enforcers emerged, their faces grim and silent. Emily counted at least 4, all armed, all with the unmistakable aura of those who controlled everything within these walls. She had underestimated them. She had thought she could expose the truth, but now she realized just how far the mine's reach went. "You won't get away with this," Emily said, her voice shaky but strong. Mrs. Graham chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "I already have. You and your little friends are just another set of bodies to dispose of. You think the world cares about you. No one will believe your lies. The mine is too powerful." Emily's pulse quickened. She was trapped. The walls of the mine were closing in on her once more, and this time there was no escape. But there was one thing Mrs. Graham hadn't accounted for. Nathan, his face set with determination, stepped forward. "She's right," he said, his voice hard, "but we're not going to let you win." Before Emily could react, Nathan lunged at one of the enforcers, knocking him off balance. The sound of a scuffle filled the air as the others drew their weapons. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. They were outnumbered, but they had no choice but to fight. She turned to Sarah, pushing her behind her. "Stay back, Sarah. Don't move," she ordered, her voice sharp. Nathan fought with all his might, but the enforcers were stronger, more experienced. Emily could see the look of panic in his eyes, but she couldn't afford to lose focus. She needed to act, and she needed to do it now. As the mine's enforcers closed in, Emily's mind raced. She reached down and grabbed a sharp, jagged rock from the ground, holding it tightly in her hand. She wasn't going to die here, not like this. She wasn't going to let them bury the truth. Just as one of the enforcers lunged toward her, she threw the rock with all her strength. It struck him in the face, knocking him off balance long enough for Emily to shove him aside. The other enforcers hesitated for a moment, shocked by her sudden resistance. That hesitation was all she needed. In a blur of motion, Emily grabbed Nathan's arm and pulled him toward the exit, with Sarah close behind. The enforcer shouted after them, but they didn't stop. Emily could feel the mine shaking again, the walls groaning, the sound of crumbling earth filling the air. It wasn't just the collapse now. The mine was coming apart at the seams, and they were running out of time. They burst through the exit into the open air, and Emily took her first deep breath of freedom, but she knew it wasn't over. Mrs. Graham and the enforcers would never stop coming for them. The mine had already cost them too much, and now the real fight for survival was just beginning. But as Emily and Nathan ran toward the safety of the town, they had no idea what awaited them on the other side. The truth about the mine had already begun to spread, and the people who controlled it would stop nothing to silence them for good. The cold air outside the mine felt like a betrayal. Emily had thought that the moment she stepped out of those suffocating tunnels, she would be free from the dark, twisted labyrinth that had consumed so many lives. But instead, she felt only the weight of the mine's legacy pressing down on her chest. The truth was out, but the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. As Emily, Nathan, and Sarah sprinted toward the town, the mine's enforcers were still close behind. The thunderous crash of the mine's collapse still echoed in their ears, but they couldn't slow down. The walls that had imprisoned them for so long were falling, and the power of the mine was crumbling, but so were the lives of those who had suffered in its depths. The enforcers wouldn't give up until they silenced the truth, until they buried the children's story, just as they had buried so many of them. The town loomed ahead, its lights flickering like distant stars. It was their last hope, the place where everything had begun and everything would end. But as they approached, Emily felt a creeping sense of dread. The town was eerily silent, too silent. The streets, which should have been bustling with life, were empty. The houses, their windows dark, gave off a sense of abandonment. Something was wrong. "They know," Nathan said, his voice grim. "The mine owns this town. It always has." Emily's heart sank. It was one thing to expose the horrors of the mine, but it was another to face the reality that the town itself was complicit in its actions. The mine was the beating heart of their economy. The orphanage had been the machinery, and the town had been the grease, willing to turn a blind eye to the suffering that paid their wages. They reached the town square, but before they could make it further, a figure appeared out of the shadows. It was a man in a dark coat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His presence was unnerving, and as he stepped into the dim light, Emily's stomach turned. It was the mine's owner, the man who had orchestrated the entire system of exploitation, the man who had sold the children to the darkness below. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice smooth and cold, like the steel of the mine's walls. Emily froze. The man's eyes glinted with an unsettling calm, as though he had expected her to come running straight into his arms. Behind him, the town's enforcers emerged from the shadows, blocking their escape. "You thought you could expose the truth?" the mine owner continued, his lips curling into a smirk. "You have no idea how deep this goes. The orphanage, the mine. It's all part of something much bigger. You think you can just tear it all down with a few scribbled papers?" Emily's pulse quickened. She had thought the mine's power was contained within its walls, but the truth was more horrifying than she could have imagined. This was no ordinary mine. This was a system, a network, built on years of blood, sweat, and broken bodies, and it stretched far beyond what she had seen. Nathan stepped forward, his eyes filled with defiance. "We won't let you continue this. The children won't be your slaves anymore." The mine owner laughed. "Slaves? "You misunderstand, my friend. This isn't tea about slavery. This is about control. You think you were the first. To try and stop this, there have been others who tried to take down the system. And do you know what happened to them?" His voice turned low and threatening. "They disappeared." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. This man had been untouchable, controlling not only the mind but the very town they had come from. The people in the town, the ones who had turned a blind eye, had all been complicit in his crimes. But now, standing before her, Emily understood the true extent of the danger she faced. "You'll never escape this," the mine owner said, stepping closer. "This town belongs to me, the mine belongs to me, and no one, especially not a few children, will change that." As he raised his hand to signal the enforcers to move in, Emily's mind raced. Was there no one to help them? Was the entire town corrupt, complicit in the horror of the mine? Then something happened. A low rumble echoed through the ground beneath their feet, followed by a deafening crash. The earth shook and the buildings around them seemed to tremble. Emily looked up to see the sky above begin to darken, as though the very heavens themselves were rebelling. The mine had been destroyed, yes, but something far worse was unfolding. The foundations of the town, the very systems of control, were crumbling too. "We have to go," Nathan shouted, his voice urgent. "It's all coming down. He can't save it now." But the mine owner didn't move. He stood frozen, a cold smile still on his face. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice still calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "This town has been mine for decades. It doesn't matter how much you destroy. It'll rebuild. It'll always rebuild." Then, before Emily could process his words, a sudden, terrifying realization struck her. The mine owner's smirk faltered, his eyes flickering in confusion. He glanced over his shoulder, and Emily saw the cracks in the ground were no longer just from the mine's collapse. They were spreading, crawling toward the center of the town, as though the land itself was rejecting the mine's very existence. The power of the land, of the children who had been abused, of the oppressed everything the mine had stolen had returned. Emily could see it now. The entire town had been built on stolen lives. The earth, the very land beneath them, had finally decided to rise up against the system. The mine owner's face twisted in horror as the ground beneath him buckled. Before he could react, the earth consumed him, swallowing him whole, his voice lost in the earth's rage. Emily didn't have time to look back. She grabbed Nathan and Sarah, and together they ran. The town behind them, the system that had crushed so many, began to collapse completely. The very thing that had held them all captive for so long was finally crumbling into dust. They didn't look back as the town fell apart. They couldn't. But as they ran toward the distant horizon, Emily knew one thing for sure. The legacy of the children, the suffering, the destruction, would never be forgotten. The mine was gone, but its story, their story, would live on. Final payoff, as Emily and Nathan stood in the shadow of the town's ruins, the weight of everything they had fought for crashed down on them. The mine, the orphanage, the lives it had stolen, all of it was gone, swallowed by the earth itself. But even in the silence that followed, Emily knew this was not the end. The town had fallen, but the system was not destroyed. It had only adapted, learned from its failures. The land had fought back, yes, but the fight was far from over. The legacy of the children whose stolen lives had not been erased. It lived on in Emily's heart, in Nathan's eyes, and in the whispers of those who had once been silenced. The truth had been uncovered, but the battle for justice had just begun. The mine was gone, but the hunger for power that would never die.